The afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Washington, D.C., reflecting off the towering structures of power that lined Pennsylvania Avenue. Inside a sleek, modern apartment near the White House, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in U.S. history, was enjoying a rare moment of quiet. At just 27, she had already cemented her reputation as a sharp-witted, relentless defender of the administration, fearless under pressure, unshaken in the face of controversy. She stood near the window, scrolling through the latest headlines on her phone, when an unexpected call made the device vibrate in her hand. The name flashing on the screen made her heart skip a beat. President Trump. Karoline, his unmistakable voice came through, firm yet urgent. There's a religious freedom case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians is suing after being banned from praying in public. I need eyes on this. Get down there, observe, and report back. There was no hesitation. I'm on it, Mr. President. The call ended. Karoline grabbed her blazer from the back of a chair, straightening its navy blue fabric. A small silver cross pinned discreetly to the lapel caught the light for a brief second. It was a keepsake from her childhood in New Hampshire, a silent but unwavering declaration of faith. She barely thought about it. It was simply a part of her. She moved with practiced efficiency, collecting her notes, sliding into her heels, and stepping into the hallway before dialing her driver. Within minutes, she was in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, weaving through the crowded streets of the nation's capital. The radio buzzed with political analysis and news updates, but Karoline turned it off. Her mind was focused on the task ahead. She had handled her share of crises, press scandals, policy debates, even diplomatic disputes. But this case was different. This was personal. As the courthouse came into view, its stone facade looming against the city skyline, she felt an unusual tension in the air. Something about this case had already begun stirring attention. She had no idea that within the next hour she wouldn't just be an observer. She would become the story. The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped through the glass doors of the D.C. local courthouse, she was met with a wave of noise, murmurs, hushed arguments, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards from court clerks hammering out legal records. The air was thick, heavy with impatience, frustration, and the stale scent of too many people packed into too small a space. This was not the grand, polished setting of the Supreme Court. This was the chaotic, everyday grind of the judicial system. Minor disputes, petty infractions, low-stakes rulings with high personal consequences. And yet today, in the middle of all this, a case had been placed under the national spotlight. Karoline scanned the room as she made her way down the aisle. The fluorescent lighting overhead did nothing to soften the faces of the restless citizens waiting their turn before the judge. A middle-aged man a few rows ahead wore a T-shirt emblazoned with bold capital letters, "I am king." Another woman to her right sported a necklace so large and gaudy it could have been mistaken for a chandelier. No one said a word to them. No warnings. No dress code violations. She kept walking, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor, before settling into a hard wooden chair in the middle row. From here, she had a clear line of sight to the judge's bench. She set down her document bag and pulled out her phone, ready to take notes. The case at hand, a group of Christian plaintiffs challenging a local ban on public prayer, was more than just a legal dispute. It was a cultural battleground, one the president himself had taken a vested interest in. This wasn't just about a group of citizens wanting to express their faith in a public park. It was about the broader question of whether the government had the right to silence them. Karoline glanced at her watch. Just a few minutes until the hearing was set to begin. She adjusted her blazer, straightening the lapel where her silver cross rested, and refocused her attention on the front of the room. Then, the heavy wooden door behind the bench creaked open. Judge Charles Hargrove entered, his black robe pristine, his expression cold, severe. His salt and pepper hair was combed back, his wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he surveyed the room with an air of quiet authority. "All rise," a bailiff called out. Karoline stood with the rest of the room, her phone still in hand, her mind sharp and alert. She had come here to watch a trial unfold. She had no idea she was about to be put on trial herself. Judge Charles Hargrove took his seat at the bench. with the stiff posture of a man who had long considered himself the most important figure in any room he entered. He was a fixture of the D.C. judicial circuit, strict, methodical, and, as some murmured, increasingly authoritarian. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as he scanned the crowd, his sharp, narrow eyes flickering over each individual with the practiced detachment of a man who had seen thousands pass through his courtroom. His voice, when it came, was deep and clipped, cutting through the room like a gavel strike. "This is a court of law, not a place for personal expression," Hargrove declared. "If you are here, you are subject to its order." Karoline remained still, noting the way he carried himself. He was the kind of judge who ruled by sheer force of presence, expecting obedience without question. The proceedings began, moving through minor cases with cold efficiency: a traffic fine, a landlord dispute, a minor business contract violation. Hargrove handled each with robotic detachment, his judgment swift and absolute. Then, as his gaze swept the courtroom once more, his eyes locked onto Karoline. And then, something changed. He paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as if trying to place her face. Recognition flickered across his expression. He had seen her before on television at White House press briefings. But his attention wasn't just on her identity. It was on something smaller, something seemingly insignificant. The small silver cross pinned to her navy blazer. His fingers tightened around his gavel. "That cross," Hargrove said suddenly, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. "It doesn't belong here." A hush fell over the courtroom. Karoline barely flinched, her expression cool and composed. She had spent years fielding aggressive questions from hostile reporters. A courtroom was no different. She met his gaze, unshaken. "There is no rule prohibiting personal jewelry in this courtroom, Your Honor," she replied smoothly. Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is a neutral space. The display of religious symbols in a courtroom is inappropriate." Karoline's eyes flicked just briefly up toward the man in the "I Am King" t-shirt, toward the woman with the oversized necklace, both still seated comfortably without issue. "No dress code violations were mentioned when I entered, nor for anyone else here," she pointed out, her voice calm but firm. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "I run this courtroom, Miss Leavitt, and I say it is not allowed." Karoline inhaled slowly, steadying her voice. "I am here on official White House business, attending as an observer of a case concerning religious liberty. This cross," she gestured to the small silver emblem, "is a personal item fully protected under the First Amendment." The tension in the room grew thick. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she stole glances between them. Even the bailiff, James Wilson, stood a little straighter, watching the exchange with interest. Hargrove leaned forward, gripping the bench as if asserting his authority through sheer proximity. "You are disrupting my courtroom," he said, his voice low and warning. Karoline remained seated, her spine straight, her hands folded over her phone. "I am not disrupting anything, Your Honor. I am quietly observing, just as the president asked me to." Hargrove's face darkened. "Then remove it." Karoline didn't move. "No." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was no longer just an exchange, it was a confrontation. The gavel slammed down. "You are now in contempt of court." The sharp crack of Judge Hargrove's gavel rang through the courtroom, silencing the murmurs, but the tension only grew thicker. "Miss Leavitt, I am fining you $500 for contempt of court," he announced, his voice carrying a smug finality. "You will pay before you leave this building." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, hesitated before resuming typing, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. The bailiff, James Wilson, remained motionless, his jaw tightening as he observed the scene unfold. From the back of the courtroom, a low voice muttered, $500 for a cross?" Another voice, emboldened, followed. "That guy's wearing a slogan shirt. That lady's got jewelry bigger than my rent check. But she's the problem?" Karoline remained still. Her mind was already calculating. Not just the fine, not just the insult, but the implication. This wasn't about her. This was about something much bigger. She slowly stood, smoothing the fabric of her blazer, her sharp eyes onto Hargrove's. The silver cross on her lapel caught the overhead lights, gleaming like a small but undeniable symbol of defiance. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured and deliberate, "you claim that I disrupted the neutrality of this courtroom with a personal religious symbol." She gestured subtly toward the man in the I Am King t-shirt, toward the woman whose oversized necklace still glinted under the fluorescent lights. And yet, I see no rules being enforced for them. A murmur rippled through the spectators, growing louder. Hargrove's face flushed. He gripped the gavel tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping his authority intact. "Do not change the subject, Miss Leavitt," he snapped. "You are the one bringing religion into this courtroom." Karoline didn't flinch. "No, sir, I am bringing the Constitution into this courtroom." A few people in the back clapped before quickly stifling themselves. Even Mrs. Thompson, usually robotic in her role, flicked her eyes toward the judge with something close to doubt. Karoline took a step forward, resting her hands on the edge of the defendant's table. "Let me be clear," she continued. "This fine, this accusation, this entire situation, this isn't about decorum. This is about bias, and not just against me." She let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "How many others have you fined for religious symbols, Judge Hargrove?" The judge's grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles turned white. "You will not lecture me on my own courtroom," he barked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice now. Just enough for Karoline to know she had hit the mark. She glanced at the bailiff. James Wilson didn't speak, but his crossed arms and the knowing look in his eyes said enough. He'd seen this before. Mrs. Thompson had stopped typing again. The tide was turning. Karoline straightened, her confidence unwavering. "I'll pay your fine, Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp but calm. "But this isn't over." Judge Hargrove smirked, thinking he had won. But in reality, he had just started a fight he wasn't prepared for. A hush fell over the courtroom, but tension crackled in the air like a brewing storm. Karoline Leavitt, standing tall and unwavering, slowly reached for her phone, her thumb pressing subtly against the screen, recording. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled but firm. "Your Honor, I understand you have authority in this courtroom, but your authority is not above the law." Hargrove's smirk faltered. "Watch yourself, Miss Leavitt," he warned. Karoline took a calculated step closer to the bench. "No, sir. You should watch yourself, because right now you are in direct violation of the First Amendment, a constitutional right that protects religious expression, even in a government setting." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Phones slipped out of pockets. A few people discreetly hit record. Hargrove's face reddened. "This is not about your so-called constitutional rights. It's about order in my courtroom." Karoline's eyes sharpened. "Then why are others allowed to wear personal expressions, graphic t-shirts, oversized jewelry without issue? The only thing you seem to object to is faith." The judge's fingers clenched around his gavel. "That's enough." But Karoline wasn't finished. She lifted her phone, ensuring her voice was captured clearly. "Perhaps you've forgotten, Your Honor, but the Supreme Court hasn't. In Church of Lukumi Babalu I Vivu, City of Hialeah, 1993, the ruling was clear. Any government restriction that specifically targets religious practices without a compelling reason is unconstitutional." A ripple of recognition spread through the crowd. She wasn't just arguing. She was citing case law. Hargrove blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Karoline pressed on. "In that case, the city tried to suppress religious expression under the guise of maintaining neutrality, just as you are doing now. And do you know what the Supreme Court said, Judge Hargrove?" She let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "That such bias is illegal." Someone in the back whistled under their breath. Others exchanged glances, a few nodding in agreement. Even Mrs. Thompson, who had spent over a decade typing court transcripts without emotion, stared at the judge with something close to disbelief. Karoline lowered her voice, making sure every word hit its mark. "So tell me, Your Honor, do you want this fine to stand? Because if it does, I guarantee this recording won't just be played here. It'll be played in a much higher court." Hargrove's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. His mouth opened and closed, his jaw working furiously as if trying to summon the authority he had always relied on. But something had shifted. The power was no longer his. In the silence that followed, the bailiff, James Wilson, gave the slightest nod of approval. The crowd had already chosen a side, and it wasn't his. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, phones flashing as more and more people secretly recorded the confrontation. Judge Hargrove's once unshakable authority was now crumbling before everyone's eyes. Realizing he had lost control, the judge slammed his gavel once more, this time not in power, but in desperation. "This hearing is over," he barked, his voice strained. "Miss Leavitt, pay your fine and leave." But Karoline had already won. She gathered her documents, lifted her phone, and walked out with her head held high. What she didn't know yet was that the battle wasn't staying inside the courtroom. It was about to go national. The hashtag that changed everything. By the time Karoline reached her car, her phone was vibrating nonstop. She slid into the back seat, exhaling sharply before checking her screen. Her name was everywhere. The video of her confrontation with Judge Hargrove, her calm, legal takedown, his flustered reaction, the gavel slamming in frustration had already begun to spread. Someone in the courtroom had uploaded it with the caption, "White House press secretary fined $500 for wearing a cross." But she didn't just take it. She fought back and made the judge speechless. The hashtag cross in court was trending within minutes. Karoline scrolled through the flood of reactions. This is what fighting for freedom looks like. Karoline Leavitt stood her ground. Hargrove should be investigated. Insane. A judge fines her for a tiny cross while letting others wear whatever they want. Bias, plain and simple. The left's war on faith is real. This is proof. Cross in court. Anyone got the full video? This needs to be everywhere. And then the notification that changed everything. President Donald Trump had tweeted, "Karoline Leavitt, my amazing press secretary, just taught a corrupt judge a lesson on religious freedom. Legal genius. We will not let them suppress faith in America. Cross in court." The tweet exploded, racking up 50,000 retweets in under 30 minutes. Conservative media outlets pounced. Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Newsmax all ran breaking stories. White House press secretary faces off with judge over cross and wins big. Is the legal system biased against Christians? The Karoline Leavitt case proves it. Trump's press secretary takes on judicial corruption and sparks a movement. Hargrove under fire. Inside his office, Judge Hargrove sat stiffly behind his desk, his phone vibrating endlessly. He ignored the first dozen calls, then the next dozen. He turned on the news and immediately wished he hadn't. His face was everywhere. Clips of his argument with Karoline played on loop, commentators tearing him apart. Even legal analysts who usually avoided political debates were questioning his actions. And then the worst of it, his judicial colleagues were calling. He had been exposed. Karoline prepares for the next move. Back at the White House, Karoline received a call from Trump's senior advisor. "The president wants you to address this. We're going to turn this into a fight for religious freedom." Karoline smiled slightly, watching the firestorm unfold online. Hargrove thought he could shut her down with a fine. Instead, he had just started a movement. Washington, D.C. was buzzing. The events inside the courtroom had escaped its walls and ignited a national firestorm. What began as a $500 fine over a small silver cross had turned into a full-scale controversy, with the White House, the media, and the public demanding answers. Judge Charles Hargrove, once seen as an unshakable figure in the judiciary, now sat at the center of an unfolding scandal, and the pressure was mounting. The investigation begins. By the following morning, the Washington Judicial Council had launched an official inquiry. The combination of public outrage, legal experts weighing in, and the White House's direct involvement made it impossible to ignore. Inside a sterile conference room at the Judicial Council's office, Linda Martinez, a senior investigator with over 20 years of experience, spread out a growing pile of case files on the table. She turned to her team, her expression grim. "We've got 48 hours to compile a report," she said. "Start pulling everything on Hargrove, past fines, complaints, inconsistencies. If there's a pattern, we need to find it." It didn't take long. The records spoke for themselves. Over the past year alone, 70% of Hargrove's fines for courtroom dress violations targeted religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, yarmulkes, while others wearing political slogans, provocative t-shirts, or flashy accessories had been ignored. And then came the most damning evidence. A notebook, handwritten, meticulously kept by none other than Mrs. Thompson, Hargrove's longtime court clerk. The whistleblowers speak out, Mrs. Thompson sat across from the investigators, her hands folded tightly, her voice steady but laced with conviction. "I've worked under Judge Hargrove for 12 years, she began, and I've seen this pattern play out over and over again. She slid her notebook forward. I started keeping records, she continued, not officially, just because it didn't sit right with me. The investigators flipped through the pages, filled with dates, case numbers, and notes. September 14th, 2024, man fined $300 for wearing a cross. October 20th, 2024, Muslim woman fined $200 for a hijab. December 5th, 2024, teen fined $250 for a Star of David necklace. January 2025, 3 people in political shirts ignored. Linda Martinez's eyes narrowed. And you never reported this before. Mrs. Thompson swallowed. Who would I report it to? Hargrove was the system in that courtroom, until now. James Wilson confirms the bias. The next testimony came from James Wilson, the bailiff, who had been standing just a few feet away when Hargrove fined Karoline Leavitt. I've been a bailiff here for 15 years, Wilson said, and I can tell you, what happened to Miss Leavitt, that wasn't the first time. He leaned forward, his voice edged with frustration. I counted at least 20 times last year when Hargrove fined people for wearing religious symbols. But a guy walks in with a vulgar slogan on his shirt? Nothing. A woman with a necklace the size of a chandelier? Nothing. It was always the religious folks. His testimony, combined with Mrs. Thompson's notebook of evidence, cemented the case. By the afternoon, Linda Martinez's team compiled a full report, a damning record of systemic religious bias in Hargrove's courtroom. Hargrove's world begins to crumble. Inside his office, Hargrove sat in his chair, his phone buzzing nonstop. Calls from the Judicial Council, reporters demanding comments, colleagues distancing themselves from him. He turned on the news, only to see his own face plastered across the screen. Breaking. D.C. judge faces investigation for alleged religious bias. He turned it off. His hands trembled as he gripped his coffee mug, his mind racing. How had this happened? He knew the answer. Karoline Leavitt. She hadn't just fought back, she had exposed him, and now his 30-year career was hanging by a thread. Judge Charles Hargrove sat in silence, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a collapsing ceiling. Across the conference table, Linda Martinez and the Washington Judicial Council stared him down, the evidence of his bias spread before him. Court records, Mrs. Thompson's handwritten notebook, and a signed statement from James Wilson, his own bailiff. Hargrove's face was pale, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. He had ruled over his courtroom with absolute authority for decades. Now, that authority was slipping away, exposed for the entire nation to see. Linda Martinez didn't bother softening the blow. Judge Hargrove, based on our findings, you are suspended effective immediately, pending further disciplinary action. The words hung in the air. The gavel had finally fallen on him. A final, feeble defense. Hargrove inhaled sharply. This is being blown out of proportion, he muttered, shaking his head. I was just trying to maintain order in my courtroom. Linda raised an unimpressed eyebrow. Order or personal bias? She tapped a page in the report. You fined religious individuals at a rate of 70% higher than others. You dismissed political slogans, provocative clothing, even outright disruptions. But a cross? That's where you drew the line? Hargrove swallowed hard, but before he could respond, Martinez leaned forward. And let's not forget, this isn't just about Karoline Leavitt. This is about dozens of people over the years. People you silenced, people you punished for their faith. Silence. Hargrove clenched his jaw. He had nothing left to say. He had lost. Karoline pushes for reform. While Hargrove was reeling from his downfall, Karoline Leavitt wasn't celebrating. She was planning her next move. From the White House press office, she watched as news networks covered the suspension. The hashtag #CrossInCourt was still trending, but Karoline knew this wasn't just about one judge. It was about fixing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. That evening, standing at the White House podium before a room full of reporters, she made her stance clear. This isn't just about me, she declared, her voice carrying through the packed briefing room. It's about ensuring that no American, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or of any faith, has to fear being penalized for their beliefs in a court of law. She let the statement settle before continuing. I'm calling for a nationwide review of judicial fairness regarding religious expression. No judge should wield their personal bias as if it were the law. The reporters scribbled furiously. Flashes fired. The movement had begun. The system starts to change under public pressure and the White House's involvement. The Washington Judicial Council announced sweeping reforms. New guidelines barring judges from targeting religious symbols in courtrooms. Mandatory First Amendment training for all judges, clerks, and courtroom staff. A public transparency board to review complaints against judicial bias. Other states took notice. Texas, Florida, Ohio. Legislators in conservative states began reviewing their own judicial systems, ensuring that faith was not treated as a violation. The impact of Karoline's defiance had spread far beyond one courtroom. Hargrove's last stand. Days later, Judge Hargrove sat alone in his office, watching his career disintegrate in real time. His phone rang. It was the Judicial Council, demanding his resignation. For the first time in 30 years, he felt powerless. He exhaled, his fingers hovering over his laptop keyboard before finally typing a single sentence. I resign, effective immediately. The moment he hit send, he knew it was over. His reign had ended. Back at the White House, Karoline sat at her desk, a framed receipt hanging on the wall, the $500 fine she had paid. She had kept it, not as a loss, but as a reminder of what one fight could change. Her phone buzzed. President Trump. You shook the system, Karoline. This is just the beginning. She smiled slightly, adjusting the silver cross still pinned to her blazer. This fight had started in a small courtroom, but it had echoed across the country. The reverberations of the courtroom battle extended far beyond the walls of the D.C. courthouse. What had started as a single moment of defiance had transformed into a national reckoning on religious freedom in the judicial system. The Washington Judicial Council, under immense public pressure, convened an emergency session. After reviewing the overwhelming evidence, Karoline Leavitt's viral testimony, the damning statistics, and firsthand accounts from whistleblowers like Mrs. Thompson and James Wilson, they issued a sweeping set of reforms. No judge may ban or penalize religious symbols in a courtroom unless they pose a clear and direct disruption. Mandatory First Amendment training for all judges, clerks, and courtroom staff, ensuring they fully understand constitutional protections on religious freedom. A judicial oversight committee to investigate future complaints of religious bias swiftly and transparently. It was a massive victory, but the impact didn't stop in D.C. A movement spreads. Karoline's stand had awakened something much bigger. Governors in Texas, Florida, and Ohio announced that they would conduct similar reviews of courtroom policies on religious expression. Conservative lawmakers drafted legislation that would codify protections against judicial overreach on matters of faith. Across social media, a new trend emerged. People from all walks of life, of all faiths, posting photos of themselves wearing crosses, yarmulkes, hijabs, and religious symbols with the caption, "My faith, my right, cross in court." Within days, the hashtag had amassed over 1 million mentions. News outlets, both conservative and mainstream, ran panels discussing judicial bias, using Hargrove as a case study in how unchecked power could erode constitutional rights. Hargrove faces his own reckoning. Former Judge Charles Hargrove sat alone in his office, staring blankly at his resignation letter. He had spent 30 years believing he was enforcing order. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, the statistics, the testimony his own past rulings laid bare, he saw it for what it was. Bias. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Linda Martinez, the Judicial Council investigator who had led the inquiry, stepped inside. "I'm here to discuss next steps," she said. Hargrove exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're here to make sure I don't fight this," he muttered. Linda shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm here to offer you a chance to do something different." She slid a document across the desk. Hargrove glanced at the title, First Amendment and Judicial Fairness Training Program, Enrollment Form. He frowned. "You want me to take the training?" Linda's expression was unreadable. "You spent years enforcing the law the wrong way. Maybe it's time you learned to apply it the right way." For the first time in 3 decades, Hargrove found himself speechless. After a long silence, he picked up a pen and signed. A new era of accountability. Months later, Hargrove sat in a training session surrounded by young judges and clerks, absorbing the very lessons he had once ignored: freedom of religion, equal treatment under the law, the limitations of judicial authority. For the first time, he listened. He wasn't the only one. Across the country, judges and legal professionals were undergoing the same training as states implemented new safeguards against judicial bias. And at the White House, Karoline Leavitt stood before a crowd of thousands, delivering a speech on constitutional freedoms. "This fight was never just about me," she said, her voice unwavering. "It was about every American's right to express their faith without fear of government suppression." She touched the silver cross on her blazer, now a national symbol of resilience. "The system only changes when people stand up," she continued, "and we are just getting started." The crowd erupted, voices carrying the movement forward. Karoline had walked into a courtroom expecting to observe. Instead, she had ignited a revolution. The sun dipped low over Washington, D.C., casting golden light across the White House lawn. Inside the press briefing room, a crowd of journalists, officials, and religious leaders sat waiting for the woman who had shaken the system. Karoline Leavitt. The door opened, and she stepped forward, poised, confident, her silver cross still pinned to her blazer, now a symbol recognized by millions. The room fell silent as she approached the podium. She scanned the sea of faces before her, knowing this moment was far bigger than herself. "3 months ago," she began, "I walked into a courtroom to observe a case." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But when a judge fined me $500 for wearing a small cross, I realized this wasn't just about me." She lifted a small framed piece of paper and held it up for the cameras. The $500 fine receipt. "I paid this fine," she said, voice unwavering, "but I didn't just accept it. I fought back." The room erupted in flashes from reporters' cameras. She placed the frame back on the podium. "This is no longer just a receipt. It's a reminder that when faced with injustice, we have two choices: accept it or change it." A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. She continued, "Because of that fight, the Washington Judicial Council has issued new rules banning religious bias in the courts. Other states are following. Judges are being trained, and people across the country are standing up for their rights." The crowd clapped, some even standing. At the back of the room, President Trump watched, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. Later that night, as Karoline sat in her office, she opened a stack of letters from people across America. A young law student from Texas wrote, "I was scared to challenge authority, but your case gave me the courage to fight for my beliefs. Thank you." A mother from Ohio shared, "My son was disciplined for wearing a cross at school. We fought back and won because of you." A pastor from Florida said, "You didn't just defend faith, you defended freedom. That's what America is about." She exhaled, setting the letters down, eyes lingering on the framed fine. One judge had tried to silence her. Instead, he had awakened a movement. As she gazed out at the city skyline, a text buzzed on her phone. "They tried to shut you down, and now you're a national icon. Enjoy the victory, Karoline. More battles to come." She smiled, fingers grazing the cross still pinned to her blazer. The battle had been won. But the fight for freedom, it was just beginning.